Brackenfield was a river town where the church bell was meant to speak for the dead, one slow toll for each life so the sound crossed water and wheat. That summer it did not speak. People left their windows open for air and listened for a note that never came while the county register filled with 19 names in a neat, calm hand. The clerk blotted the ink and told anyone who asked that families wanted quiet. Across town, the undertaker polished handles that never met earth and told himself this new hush was kindness. Dr. Erasmus Vale walked the narrow streets with a soft hat and a softer voice, a man who looked at sorrow without blinking and promised to spare people pain. He certified each passing on paper that smelled faintly of milk and carbolic, signed with a steady line that curled like a blessing. And he said graves were no longer required when a home had already held the last breath in peace. The town believed him because he was gentle and exact, because he never raised his voice, because he hated scenes and said grief should not be made to perform. The sexton oiled the bell rope out of habit and found it pale and clean where hands should have darkened it. He thought of pulling once to test the clapper, then stopped. Brackenfield had decided silence was decent. The Gazette printed births and wheat prices and river levels, but death arrived by private letter now, sealed with the doctor's mark. The mercy circle, church women in white aprons, moved like careful moths with basins and folded veils. They told families to rest and not draw a crowd, not in heat, not with fever about. Pastor Weir preached the goodness of a clean goodbye and thanked the doctor for his mercy towards the frail. Sheriff Abel Rowan told men on porches to let the mercy women work and said some love is meant to be private. In his cellar, the doctor opened a leather book and numbered the day's stillness with tidy dots and short lines. Counting the seconds a chest held its quiet as if silence were a patient tool he could shape. He believed care looked like order. He believed order looked like mercy. He wound his pocket watch at the same hour each night and paused with his eyes half shut. Not in prayer, but in listening for the thin pause between inhale and what followed. He liked the way a house, after struggle stopped, fell into a single note you could feel in your ribs if you were willing to be still. On paper, it all looked decent. The register numbers rose in orderly rows. The streets did not fill with carriages. The bell rope stayed unused. A woman asked the clerk if a person could be gone without a ring, and the clerk said yes if the family wished it. People repeated that rule until it felt old, as if it had always been there like the ferry schedule, or the rule about nets and spawn. The town did not mean harm. It had learned to love a low room and a shut door and a doctor who kept the worst of things small. Only small, odd facts drew notice and then drifted. The undertaker's shelves full, a rush on white muslin at the mill, a sweet, sour smell by the bathhouse drain, lines and dust that matched the width of a rail behind the doctor's cart. A blackbird nested in the bell mouth and no one chased it away. Children counted fireflies and did not learn to count tolls. By the end of summer, 19 names lay flat in the ledger with no sound to carry them. One evening, the 20th envelope found a widow on her porch holding her husband's boots that were not yet cool. She turned the paper over twice and listened for the bell that did not ring, counting to 10 and then to 50 because that felt like what a town should give for a life. She watched the tower and saw the rope hang slack and pale as straw. In that held breath, she felt the first dry crack in the story she had accepted. She went inside for the county sheet, ran her finger down the column, and found his name declared without a grave. She stood in the doorway with the boots against her chest and decided the bell must be made to speak. Martha Klein sat on her porch with the river whispering and a sealed envelope in her lap. She warmed the wax, broke it, and read the tidy line that made the evening tilt. Eli Klein, eldest son, deceased of sudden quiescence, certified by Dr. Erasmus Vale, Interment unnecessary at family request. She had made no such request. There was no coffin, no bell, no procession, only the smell of cut hay and the scratch of a barn swallow under the eaves. Inside, Eli's boots waited by the door, and the straw tick kept the hollow of his back like a small shoreline that refused to smooth out. Her two younger boys asked if they should fetch the pastor, and she told them to wash for supper and keep their voices low because the house felt thin, as if one hard word could tear it. After they slept, she sat with the boots and counted minutes like a nurse counts a pulse, hearing a weight on the steps that matched Eli coming home late. She counted to 60 and then began again, steady as a clock that refuses to speak its meaning, until the night cooled around the numbers and would not give anything back. In the morning, a second envelope lay under the door in the same hand, this one for Mrs. Pike next door. Her husband declared by the same phrase and the same mercy. Martha held both pages and felt how neat deaths looked when the town agreed to keep them small. She had buried her husband 2 winters ago with earth and ropes and the hard sound of clods on wood. She remembered the bell and the men with hats in their hands and the way the river carried the toll across water so everyone had to stop and listen. This new way asked for nothing but a signature and a closed curtain. She placed the envelopes side by side and saw that the ink curled the same way on the D of declared and the V of Vale, a careful hand that disliked noise. She took the papers to the Brackenfield Gazette because print is heavier than talk, and the room smelled of ink and metal and the faint sting of oil. Behind the counter, a young typesetter named Clara Baines fed thin slips into the composing stick with steady fingers and looked up when Martha asked how long it took a death notice to appear. Clara said the bell would usually ring before the form even dried, and then she frowned because nothing had rung for weeks and she had set no obituaries even though people whispered about letters. Martha laid the envelopes on the counter and watched Clara read the neat lines without speaking. Clara's brow drew tight. She tried the notice drawer. Then the locked cabinet marked hold for solemnity. Clara found nothing she could show, only a note to leave such matters to the doctor and the pastor, signed in the editor's different hand. She told Martha she would ask again, but the words did not lift. They settled between them like fine dust from the cases of letters. That night Martha held Eli's boots to her chest and counted minutes again, not for comfort now, but to keep herself from making a sound that would frighten the sleeping boys. Each count was a small refusal to let the page be the last word. She could not accept a death that fit in one line and left no mark on the ground. In the morning she went back to the Gazette with a loaf for the girl and found Clara already waiting with eyes that had counted their own minutes. Clara said notices never reached the forms, that someone signed for them and moved them where she could not follow without a key. The words made Martha colder than any river wind, but they also put a line under the day. She left the loaf, kept the envelopes, and turned toward the print shop's locked cabinet like a person moving toward a door they intend to open whether or not the room beyond wants company. Behind that door, she felt, lay the missing sound, the part of grief the town had folded away and called decent for convenience. Clara Baines wore the keys she was allowed, and learned which locks did not belong to her by how they refused to turn. The cabinet behind the editor's desk refused like a held breath. A paper label in the editor's careful hand read, "Hold for solemnity," as if grief needed a cupboard. When the office emptied for dinner, she slid out the lower type drawer, squeezed her shoulder in, and found a second thin drawer hidden behind the frame. She teased the lock with a composing rule until the spring gave and air touched her face that smelled like a sick room after everyone has left. Inside lay pulled obituaries, tidy galleys wiped pale by solvent, the letters faint as old bruises. She pressed a sheet to her nose and smelled ether and milk. Names she knew and names she had only heard in whispers sat in orderly lines, each marked declared, each signed by Dr. Erasmus Vale. None stamped for print. This drawer did not store words, it kept them from the world. She borrowed a pencil and copied the names into a single column, straight as a spine, 29 within 10 months, clusters like fevers and then lulls. A farmhand, Jonah Pike, walked in to post a mule sale and seeing her list remarked the way people remark on wind, that Vale's cart rolled past his gate after midnight toward the old ice house and came back light, and that nobody needed ice at that hour unless someone feared the day. Clara wrote ice house beside the column as if a small word could stitch breath to paper. She folded the list and carried it to Sheriff Abel Rowan because law should weigh more than a drawer. He listened with one hand over his badge and kept his eyes on the column as if it pointed at him. He said she must not stir panic. He said Vale had walked the floor with his wife through fever and had spared her a public scene, and that quiet was mercy when a town could not afford loud grief. He said order saves the weak. She heard the debt under his words and the fear of being seen as a man who owed. She asked in the same low tone whether the bell rope was now decoration and whether the ground needed the dead less than paper did. His jaw tightened. He returned the page with 2 fingers and told her again to leave the matter to the doctor and the pastor. She thanked him so he would remember her as courteous when he woke at night. Back at the Gazette, she pinned her column under the lip of the workbench where the editor could not see and used it as a map. She marked Fridays when the Mercy Circle met and mornings when fog sat low on the river. She watched the street at 11 and at 2 and once saw the doctor's wagon whisper along the scar of rail toward the river road, the horse moving like a creature trained to make no sound. She followed far enough to taste sawdust and feel the soft exhale the old ice house gave the night, a warmth that did not belong to fire. If the drawer ate names, the ice house ate sound. She kept the list in her apron and underlined 29 until the pencil tore a tiny hole that looked like an eye. In daylight, Brackenfield remained decent. The bell rope hung clean. People lifted hats and spoke about wheat and ferries, but the map in her pocket tightened streets into a single path that bent to the river, to the place where winter slept in sawdust and where, if she kept walking, she would learn what kind of mercy breathed only at night. She fixed her hand on the warped door and listened for glass, a bell too small for any church. At the old ice house by the river, Clara expected the clean bite of cold wood and the sharp wet of the river in her nose. Instead, the air met her like a weak hospital, sweet and sour at once, carbolic laid over milk that had turned. Jonah Pike held the lantern low and the beam showed sawdust fat with moisture, not winter's frost. And along the plank wall a new panel sat on iron sliders, its edges scraped bright by recent hands. The sliding wall opened with a rolled breath, and the room behind it felt too still for a place meant to hold ice. Oval rings had been cut into the ice as if someone pressed a warm bowl there until it settled. Each hollow wore a cloth halo dried into a stiff rim, and above each ring a small glass bell hung from a thin wire, inverted like a clear helmet that wanted a face. The wire quivered when the door side shut, and the glass answered with a tiny note. Jonah said he had seen Vale carry a crate with the word lungs stenciled on the side and thought it meant medicine until now. There were no bodies here, only depressions, as if what had once lain in these ovals was warmer than ice, and had chosen not to leave a trace anyone could argue with. Clara ran a fingertip along one ring and felt the shallow ridge where the cloth had kept the ice from kissing skin. At the center, a small hole showed the place where air would have rushed out when the glass came down. The bells were not bells. They were mouths turned to hush. On a shelf near the door, a rubber bulb with a cracked seam sat beside lengths of narrow hose and a small brass valve with a thumb screw that made a human sound when she turned it closed, the click of a decision. She understood then that a dome brought down over a face, sealed to a wet cloth, could make a small weather of its own, could drink breath and thin a chest until ribs stopped climbing. The room did not speak of rage or struggle. It spoke of tidy hands and timed minutes, of someone who believed that quiet could be built like a cradle and used like a lid. In the far corner, the straw still bore a curve that matched a shoulder, and on a beam above it a pencil note read proof in a hand that liked straight letters. If this was mercy, it had a machine's heart. Jonah stood with both fists at his sides, a man trying to force his arms not to do what his mind told them. He named each mark as if naming would free him. Ring, wire, bell, valve, proof. Clara wrote glass lung bell in her pocketbook because things need names before a town will face them, and she tested the weight of the term on her tongue and found it fit too well. The lantern threw their shadows on the wall and made them look like people already laid under domes. They backed out as if leaving a nursery where they did not belong, and pulled the slider shut and waited for the air to settle. Outside, the river took them in like it always had, but it could not clean the smell from their clothes. Clara knew the townspeople would not trust her fear alone, and the sheriff carried a debt to the doctor that would blind him. So she turned the plan in her head until it clicked like the brass screw. She would carry these facts to a medical mind with no stake in Brackenfield, someone who could give plain words to a cruel room. And at dawn she set train fare under her ledger and prepared to leave for the city. Dr. Lucius Banner did not wear grief the way the townsfolk of Brackenfield did, neatly folded, quietly held behind aprons and church words. He was a man of clean fingernails and direct sentences, a visiting physician from Springfield who read Clara's sketch of the ice house like it was a blueprint for something old and shameful. When she spoke of the oval rings in the ice and the inverted glass bells, he did not blink or scoff. He turned to his valise and retrieved a sheaf of papers on cryostasis and pulmonary control, readjusted his spectacles and asked if the air had smelled sweet. She said it had. Then he nodded once and told her what she needed to know in words sharp enough to slice open the dark. Those bells, if fitted correctly over the mouth and nose and sealed with cloth soaked in cooling agents, could thin the breath, slow the lungs, and coax a body into what he called a reversible quieting. The term sounded clinical, but behind it was a horror that did not tremble. If cold and chemical timing were just right, he said, the pulse would slow beneath detection, and the breath would pause without bursting the chest. The person would appear gone, but only to eyes willing to believe it. He told Clara that if you let someone linger too long in that stillness, the vessels begin to collapse in on themselves. He called it internal shearing. You couldn't pull them back without cost. A limb might wake, but not a brain. A heart might beat, but not recall love. This was not rest, he warned. It was a silence so deep it forgot how to return. She asked if such a method could be used for death itself. He said it was worse than death because it asked people to accept the lie of peace when the body was only paused. If a person wanted to pretend mercy, this was the perfect illusion. If a person wanted to study stillness, it was the perfect trap. Clara folded her notes with shaking hands and boarded the first cart back to Brackenfield, with the understanding that death might not have come to those 29 names. They might have only been quieted, suspended beneath glass and breathless cloth, their bodies told to wait. But for what? And where? She returned with new fear, not of what Vale had done, but of what might still be breathing under dust, waiting for someone to decide whether stillness was final. The town looked the same when she stepped off the cart, same windows, same bell, same women on porches snapping beans. but the shadows felt fuller, as if something lay under every board, patient and pressed flat. The Gazette smelled like ink and oil and unread truths. She placed the notes beneath her ledger and walked the long loop toward the church. That's when she saw the sign, a new flyer tacked to the chapel door announcing the formation of a mercy circle for the infirm, hosted weekly in the parish hall under the care of Pastor Silas Weir and Dr. Erasmus Vale. Comfort for the suffering, ease without spectacle. She stood before the sign and imagined curtains drawn tight around cots, muslin veils pressed to fevered lips, the same kind of cloth that left rings in ice. She imagined Vale's hand moving gently across a brow, not with malice but with belief. It would be easy to say he was cruel, but Clara felt now more than ever that he was something worse. He was certain that stillness was a gift, certain that the bell was too loud, certain that bodies were more obedient than grief. And with the pastor beside him, with curtains and cots and quiet prayers, he would keep practicing. Clara stared at the flyer until the wind tore one corner loose. The river sounded far away. Her fear was no longer about what had happened. It was about what might still be happening behind those curtains where comfort looked so close to control. The parish hall did not smell like worship. It smelled of beeswax and boiled linen and something faintly sour like milk on a high shelf. Clara stepped through the side door during the Mercy Circle's preparation hour and was not stopped. No one raised a voice or asked her purpose. The women inside moved slowly and precisely, sleeves rolled, faces calm, as if kindness required no permission. At the center of them stood Dorothea Pike, sister of Jonah, her apron smooth and her eyes dry with devotion. She spoke softly to the younger women as they folded squares of white linen into narrow bands, dipping them into wax warmed over a spirit flame. "It keeps the silence clean," she said, turning a strip of cloth until it gleamed with a hard sheen. "So the soul doesn't lose its way in noise." Clara walked carefully, pretending she had been sent for errand or errata, and drifted toward the curtain at the rear of the hall, drawn tight like skin pulled over something breathing. When Dorothea stepped aside, Clara eased the edge open just enough to see. Behind it stood a row of frames that might once have been chairs, stripped to their bones and rebuilt with purpose. Each had no seat, only a harness of padded leather bands looped across the height of the frame, 2 for the ribs, 1 for the shoulders, and another at the throat, loose but near. It looked like something built not to restrain a person, but to teach them stillness by degrees. Clara watched as one woman tested the buckles, pulling gently until the harness bowed inward like lungs under a slow hand. On a nearby table sat a tray of thimbles resting in warm water, each the kind used for hand stitching, each polished until it caught the lantern light. Dorothea explained their use to the younger women with the calm of scripture. The thimble test, she said, was for certainty. A warm thimble pressed to the tongue would fog if breath remained. If it did not, the soul has stepped out. The women nodded as if it were no more than checking a fever, and Clara realized they truly believed it. None of them looked afraid. None of them knew that these thimbles fed a ledger, Vale's ledger. None of them understood that the waxed linen wasn't just for peace, but for imprint. That the band pressure wasn't easing death, but scripting it, controlling the tempo like a player pressing keys in a silent tune. Clara leaned in to read the stitching on the harness straps, now dark with use. Each bore a small set of letters sewn in threads slightly darker than the leather, initials. Some she recognized from her hidden obituary list, others were new. Every band was marked, every quiet passing had a name encoded in wax and buckled breath. Clara stepped back, swallowed her revulsion, and smiled when Dorothea noticed her. She asked where the harnesses had come from. Dorothea said they were ordered by Dr. Vale and adjusted by Ellen Harrow, the seamstress near the edge of town who understood the anatomy of fabric. Clara thanked her with a nod and walked out as if dismissed. But her stomach twisted at the thought. These women, these believers in clean goodbyes, were being used. They were not evil. They were a system made to feel holy, built to tighten a belt without asking where it came from or who chose the pressure. Clara pulled her notebook from her coat and scribbled 2 words beneath the thimble diagram. Ritual comfort. The language of death made polite, the sowing of breath into silence. She didn't stop to think what she would find at Ellen Harrow's door. She already knew it would be stitched, and clean, and tight. Ellen Harrow lived above the tailor shop her father built, where windows faced the river but never opened wide. She had the voice of someone who didn't speak unless asked, and hands that moved as if they still held thread even when empty. When Clara stepped into the workroom, the air was full of dust, starch, and the quiet industry of garments meant for events that no longer happened, weddings, christenings, and the kind of funerals that used to require black crepe. Clara didn't pretend to browse. She unrolled the strap she'd lifted from the parish harness and laid it across the table, initials up, stitchwork fine. "Did you sew this?" she asked. Ellen looked down, nodded once, and said yes. She'd stitched many, at Vale's request for order. The initials, she said, were for ease of assignment, easier to return straps to the right harness after washing. Her voice was soft but not ashamed. "I was told it was medical," she added, "for posture, for breath correction, for easing strain on the ribs." She reached for a leather-bound pattern book from the shelf behind her, its corners worn, its pages smudged with chalk and oil. Between diagrams of corset boning and truss rigging sat a folded paper labeled the tuning loom, in Vale's hand, exact and architectural. Clara unfolded it like a blueprint and found lines arcing in soft diagonals across the outline of a rib cage. "Pressure should follow exhale," one note read. Another, "Stillness taught by consistent tension, not pain." The design mimicked music, straps set not straight across but angled, like strings drawn to different tones. The loom, it seemed, wasn't just a frame. It was an instrument. Clara imagined the frame in the parish hall again, the bands pulling in rhythm, the body trained to hush itself. Ellen said Vale paid well, never rushed, always brought diagrams. He told her silence was a gift for those who suffered and that sometimes the body needed to be reminded to rest. Clara asked how many straps she'd made. Ellen hesitated. "More than I'd like to count now." The thread was strong, waxed linen, easy to clean. Clara asked if she'd seen any of the patients. Ellen said no, but once she had visited the bathhouse where Vale sent other cloth orders. Clara looked up. "Bathhouse?" Ellen nodded. She said the Mercy Circle prepared muslin veils, soaked in milk and carbolic to cool the foreheads of the ill. "It makes them still," she said, her fingers fidgeting with the corner of the pattern. "It lays flat, leaves no marks. Just sleep." Something flickered behind Ellen's eyes then. Something cracked, like a window she'd kept shut too long. She stepped away, opened a drawer beneath her cutting board, and pulled out a thin brass key with a green ribbon tied to the bow. "There's a shelf," she said, "behind the bathhouse hearth. It's built into the wall. I stitched for the veils, too. I didn't—" She stopped, then finished. "I thought it was for easing fevers. But the cloth came back, dry, always dry." She pressed the key into Clara's hand and turned away, as if the guilt had finished speaking and the seamstress had resumed. Clara folded the loom diagram and tucked it into her coat. She left the shop with the weight of stitched breath behind her. The idea that silence could be crafted like a garment, shaped, fitted, perfected. And if the harness taught the body to forget motion, Then perhaps the veil taught the face to forget itself. She walked fast toward the river, key tight in her palm, and the bathhouse waiting with its water and walls and whatever still lay behind them. The bathhouse by the river was meant for relief. That's what it had always been called, relief for the body, the lungs, the fevered brow. Clara stepped through the warped door and found the air thick with the sweet, sour cling of milk that had sat too long near heat. The scent was faintly floral at first, like something meant to calm. But beneath it lay a quiet rot, carbolic in whey and something metallic that clung to the back of her throat like breath that wouldn't rise. Light filtered through high panes onto brass pans set in neat rows along a low table, each filled with a pale liquid that shimmered faintly with surface oil. Folded muslin veils, the kind seamstresses cut for funerals, soaked in the milk like paper-thin lungs waiting for a face. They were smooth and perfect, each square marked in the corner with a tiny embroidered dot, 1, 2, or 3, and laid out like scripture. A single note was tacked to the wall above the table in Vale's unmistakable script. Declaration, stillness, proof. It wasn't a poem, it was a method. Each word carried weight. Declaration was the doctor's role, what he chose to see. Stillness was the bath, the veil, the hush of a body persuaded not to move. Proof was the final thing, the unquestionable silence a machine could measure. Clara moved past the pans and deeper into the side room, where slate counters met a wash basin too wide for comfort. There, beside the empty shelves, she found a wooden box about the size of a Bible with a slot at the top and a crank on one side. A paper wheel lay inside, blank save for a faint graphite circle near the center. The lid was labeled Clock of Breath in a careful serif. She turned the crank once and heard nothing. A slip of paper nearby explained the device in Vale's dry, emotionless tone. The wheel would turn gently when a person exhaled. A mark would appear with each breath. If the wheel remained unmarked for an hour, the subject was declared beyond reach. The note did not say dead, it said quiet enough to certify. Next to the device lay a small book of receipts. Clara flipped through with shaking hands. Line after line, the Mercy Circle had paid for silent hours. Blocks of time billed by the hour, stamped as fulfilled, and logged against the Brackenfield Charitable Relief Fund. One entry read 3 veils, 1 proof, 2 hours. Another, 6 thimbles prepped, 1 clock box, 4 hours under. It was a ledger of silence, and someone had assigned it value. Clara counted 6 pages before she had to set the book down. Her stomach felt sour, as if the milk had crawled from the pans into her mouth. She backed away from the table, her hand brushing the edge of a shelf, and knocked loose a stack of cloth bundles. They fell with a hush and left behind a yellowing folder wedged in the wall seam. Inside, more diagrams, veils with notations, breath charts, even adjusted measurements for children's heads, smaller bells, shallower veils. Everything was scalable. This wasn't about mercy. This was about control. Vale had built a process to engineer absence, to turn a body's last breath into a thing that could be witnessed by a needle and a wheel. And if no fog appeared on the thimble, if no mark touched the paper, then it was not a soul that left. It was a man with a pen who decided no one should look again. Clara folded the diagrams into her coat and left the bathhouse as the sun turned low over the river. The water glittered with late light, and she hated it for being beautiful. Her boots thudded too loud on the dock. Everything felt too loud now. She reached the Gazette well past supper, heart pounding with the shape of what she now knew. There were no graves because the town had traded death for a system, quiet, washable, reusable. The doctor didn't kill, he documented. The Mercy Circle didn't murder. They followed instructions. The pastor didn't doubt. He blessed the curtain. Clara had walked the whole circle now. Every part of it pointed back to the same hand, the same steady line of Vale's pen. That night she did not sleep. She took out the names again, 29, and wrote beside each one a single new word, unconfirmed. At dawn, she walked the outer path past the doctor's residence and saw what others never looked for. Near the back of his house, just beneath the cellar stairs, a brass plate was set into the stone foundation. It was no larger than her palm and mostly obscured by ivy. She brushed it clean with her coat sleeve. Etched into the metal were the words, "Specimens. R. No lock. Just a handle, and the smell of soil that had been disturbed and covered again." Her hand hovered there, not yet touching it. Because now she knew. Proof wasn't for the dead. Proof was for those still wondering whether someone they loved had simply been taught to lie still. Sheriff Abel Rowan did not want to come. His boots stayed by the threshold longer than they should have, and his hand trembled slightly when Clara passed him the brass plate she had unscrewed from the stone. Specimens. R. She didn't ask him to believe. She asked him to witness. He owed her at least that. So now they stood in the low frame of Vale's root cellar, where no roots grew and no pickling jars lined the shelves. The doctor had kept the air dry and clean, lined with lime and chalk, like a place preparing for company that never came. Lantern light fluttered against the walls as they descended the narrow stair, revealing shelf after shelf of jars, but not the kind people feared. There were no bones, no fluid-suspended limbs. Each jar held a tight paper spiral, wound like a sleeping snail, darkened with faint flecks of graphite in uneven clusters. Clara recognized the markings at once, breath traces from the clock of breath. She had seen the wheel, turned it with her own hands. These spirals were the final paper trails of someone's final hour. Proof Vale would have said that silence had won. On the lid of each jar was a name. She ran her finger across the row, E. Klein, H. Templeton, M. Crass, and more. Names from her ledger. All 29. The handwriting was careful, curved, the same tidy signature Vale used when certifying a death. Only now it looked more like a signature on a letter returned to sender. The sheriff stepped closer, frowning. He picked up one of the jars and held it to the light. "Is this what he calls a body?" Clara said nothing. She watched as his face shifted, not to anger, but to something quieter. Recognition, maybe. He had signed off on some of these names himself, not directly, but by believing what was handed to him. She didn't shame him. There was no point. This wasn't a murder scene. It was a library. In the far corner, behind a shelving unit bolted to the stone, sat a hatch she almost missed, a hinged iron square set low into the floor, the kind built for drainage or worse. She tugged the edge and felt a cold exhale rush up against her face like breath rising from a mouth that didn't know it had been closed. Sheriff Rowan helped her lift it fully, and beneath lay a ladder descending into a cut stone corridor, darker than the cellar and colder than outside. The lantern hissed slightly as they climbed down, and the flame danced against the walls, revealing something Clara had not expected. Twin rails, narrow and rust-streaked, embedded into the floor like tracks for a cart built to carry more than coal. A metal groove ran along one side, polished smooth. She stepped carefully, noting the grade of the slope. Not steep, but deliberate. The tunnel led away from the house and toward the river. She could smell it now, the wet mineral scent of current. Along the right-hand wall hung rows of thin white plates suspended by leather cords, milk glass masks, shaped like the lower half of a face with delicate curves for cheekbones and a soft flare where lips might rest. They were beautiful, in the way that surgical tools are sometimes beautiful, pure, balanced, and wrong. Each mask had faint condensation inside, as if they'd been used recently and not dried. Sheriff Rowan touched one and said softly, "Why cover the face after death?" Clara answered without thinking, to train the skin not to twitch, to hold the expression down while the breath leaves, or so it looks like it did. No bodies, just a system, a tunnel, a place where silence could be transported discreetly. At the end of the corridor, the tunnel split. The right fork rose slightly and curved away into a locked iron door marked Private Study. Clara tried the handle. It didn't budge. The left path continued downward until the rails vanished into a boarded frame with rusted hinges, a seal broken only once before. She placed her palm against the boards and felt a pulse of air, cool even now, like something meant to preserve. Sheriff Rowan looked at her with something too complicated for guilt. He said, "That's the old elevator line." He was right. The grain elevator had been shuttered last spring, officially for repairs, but everyone knew the silos had long gone empty. Clara stepped back and looked again at the tracks. They didn't lead to death. They led to storage. Vale hadn't been laying the dead to rest. He'd been placing them in order. They climbed back out in silence. The jars remained undisturbed on the shelves above them, quiet and labeled like filed letters in a forgotten office. Clara imagined Vale's hand carefully curling each spiral, sealing each breath in glass and placing it on the shelf not out of cruelty, but reverence. He believed in what he was doing. That was the part that made it worse. Outside, the air no longer felt like fall. It felt like something waiting to rise. And as she turned her face toward the distant grain elevator, Clara knew the next door wouldn't hold forever. Something had been preserved, not killed, preserved, and she was running out of time to find it before it woke. The grain elevator loomed above the river like a spent lung, tall, dry, emptied of its original harvest long ago. Its boards were silvered by wind, its doors hung crooked, and yet the rails Clara had traced from Vale's cellar ran straight to it, like veins returning to a heart that should no longer beat. She approached with Sheriff Rowan trailing behind her, lantern in hand, both of them silent as they passed the low gate. There were no padlocks. The wood protested softly as they pushed open the side door, and inside the air was immediately cooler. Too cool for the season. Not cold like ice, but regulated, purposeful. A system was still breathing here. The hum met them just past the threshold. At first, Clara thought it was natural, some trick of wind moving through the slats. But as they moved deeper into the elevator, she recognized its constancy, its pitch. A mechanical hum not of effort but of design. From the ceiling far above the rafters dangled a thick cord attached to a brass cylinder set with teeth and a hand crank. The hushing fan. It pulsed low, tuned to a sound just beneath comfort. The note vibrated inside her chest like a held breath that couldn't quite escape. The sheriff paused beneath it, blinking hard. "Feels like it's pressing down on you," he muttered, and she nodded. That was the point. The fan's droning matched a notation from Vale's tuning loom diagram. Wires tuned to keep the chest from lifting. Clara pressed her palm to her sternum and felt the weight not of fear but of obedience. It wasn't that she didn't want to speak, it was that she forgot how. They found the rails again, curving across the floor into a half circle where 7 cots were arranged like petals. The bedding was clean. Salted straw lined each, and beside them sat wooden crates filled with inverted glass bells, like the ones she'd seen in the ice house. Each bore a ring of dried milk at the base, a faint outline of use. No names marked the cots, but the intention was clear. This was a preparation floor, a holding pattern. She imagined Vale working here, sleeves rolled, moving from cot to cot, adjusting a strap, lowering a veil, turning the fan 1/4 tighter. This was not a place for death. This was a stage for suspension, cool, dry, silent. Clara circled the room, searching for breath and finding none. Just impressions, faint dents in the straw, the absence of sweat. Then she noticed the gallery above. A ring of small wooden doors stood high along the perimeter of the elevator shaft, accessed by a narrow stair and a rusted railing that groaned with disuse. She climbed slowly, each step giving a little under her weight. Most doors hung open, revealing bare rooms no larger than closets. But 3 were closed, barred from the outside with iron latches that looked newly installed. The first held only the smell of salt and the ghost of a presence. The straw inside was compressed in the shape of a human form. Arms to the sides, head turned slightly left. At the center of the chest, salt had crusted into a soft indentation. The body was gone. The memory of its weight remained. The second room bore another imprint, smaller. A ribbon lay where the pillow would have been, its fabric stiff and sugared, preserved. A child. Not an idea anymore, a person once declared. The third room had no straw, just a square of muslin laid flat across the floor and a set of brass weights along its edges. Clara stepped back before opening it fully. These were not cells, they were vessels, meant to hold breathless things until someone decided whether to return them to the world or let them fade completely. Vale hadn't just studied stillness. He had created a pipeline for it. The rail, the bath, the veil, the mask, the fan, all pieces of a single long ritual designed to imitate care while practicing command. And each stop along that line had one thing in common. No sound, not one scream, not one struggle. Just people who trusted mercy enough to lie still. The fan above them continued to hum, never rising, never falling. It pressed the world flat, and Clara felt her anger rising against its weight. She'd seen enough. No more devices, no more jars. She needed a voice now, someone who had been close enough to smell the wax, to fold the veils, to bless the stillness and tell herself it was good. She descended the stairs without speaking and turned to the sheriff. His mouth was tight, his eyes full of failure. He didn't ask where they were going next. He knew. They needed Dorothea Pike, not her apron or her hymns or her practiced silence. They needed her confession. Dorothea Pike lit a candle before she spoke, though it was noon and the sun was warm on the church steps. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes closed, not in peace but in preparation. When Clara entered the room, Dorothea didn't look up, only whispered the end of a prayer and then let the silence settle around her like a veil. It wasn't shame that held her. It was grief shaped like certainty that had begun to rot. She began simply. They had done only what the doctor taught. They softened the breath. They soaked the muslin. They listened for the absence, not of life, but of movement. Vale had spoken gently, always gently, and he had told them that screaming deaths were the real cruelty, that convulsions and gasps and wet chests filled with air, too late, were indignities the soul shouldn't have to suffer. So they made it quiet. They used the stillness harness to slow the body. They wrapped the head. They warmed the thimble in clean water and pressed it lightly to the tongue. If no fog appeared, Vale would nod and say the crossing was kind. Then the bells were brought down. Dorothea said she never felt horror, only relief. The way a mother feels when a fever breaks and the child stops crying. Stillness was proof that pain had passed. That's what she believed. She had helped carry 7 bodies to the elevator. She called them bodies, not people, not even by name, because she had let herself believe they were no longer there. The fan was already running when she arrived, the hum already tuned. She remembered laying one girl down and seeing how the bell left no condensation. That had comforted her then. But then she paused. Her eyes flicked upward. She said there was one time, a man named Elgin Meeks. He had no family, only a brother who had gone west. Dorothea remembered the day because the milk had been left too long and smelled sharp. The veil was heavy, the cloth thin from too many washes. When they laid him under it and turned the clock of breath on, she heard it mark once. A tick. A sound she had never heard after a Vale. She froze, asked Vale if he'd heard it too. He smiled and said it was just the milk settling. She accepted that. That was her sin. Dorothea's voice cracked then. Her hands, which had been clasped like someone at prayer, began to tremble as if the thimble were still in them. She said she had carried kindness like a blanket. But now it felt more like a lid. She had watched too long, trusted too long. When Clara asked about the names, Dorothea rose unsteadily and reached beneath the cabinet drawer. From behind the baseboard, she pulled a flat bundle wrapped in church linen. Inside, a narrow ledger bound in blue leather worn nearly white at the corners. The cover read only, "Unburied." Clara opened it and saw the names, all 29, but next to each was a second column, status. Some said preserved, some said trial pending. One was simply marked gone, but beneath the final page, one line had been added recently in Vale's own hand. Clara read it aloud, the words tasting wrong in her mouth. Recovery trials begin at first frost. Dorothea wouldn't meet her eyes. She only whispered. He said stillness could be reversed. He wanted to see who came back whole. Clara stood slowly, ledger clutched to her chest like a weight meant for a deeper part of the river. She thanked Dorothea not because she deserved it, but because it might be the last kindness spoken before everything broke. Outside, the wind had shifted. The trees shivered with it. Frost would come soon. And now Clara knew some of the quieted were not dead. Not yet. The county judge arrived in a black coat 2 sizes too warm for the weather, summoned not by rumor but by records. Clara's names, Dr. Banner's diagrams, Sheriff Rowan's reluctant confession. He came quietly without a retinue, carrying the kind of authority that didn't need to announce itself. Vale met him at the threshold of his home, composed as ever, hands folded around a teacup. He invited them in as if they were there for civility, not judgment, and offered the judge a seat beside the fire and a slice of orchard bread. The judge did not sit. Behind him, Banner spread out the papers, the clock of breath, the tuning harness diagrams, the receipt books marked silent hours. Vale looked over each without flinch. He explained calmly that science must sometimes appear cruel in its tools to root out the deeper cruelty of nature. He said suffering could be minimized if people were permitted to rest instead of convulse. He said the veils were peaceful, the bells were gentle, the masks were clean, and every subject had consented, or had family consent through proper mercy circle forms. Nothing hidden, all witnessed, all signed. Clara watched the judge, whose face remained unreadable. Vale continued, voice steady as a metronome, until they asked to see the elevator. The hushing fan was already turning when they entered the chamber. The gallery doors stood ajar except for one, the final barred room where the ribbon had been. The hum pressed against their ribs, making each breath feel like an interruption. The judge asked Vale if this was the place of recovery trials. Vale smiled faintly and nodded. The moment of return must be prepared for, he said. Stillness cannot be interrupted without consequence. But then the fan shuddered. It stopped, not with a slow winding down, but with a sharp metal jerk, a slip in the gear or a belt finally frayed through. The silence that followed was not peace. It was raw. Air surged into the space, and the quiet unraveled like paper held too long under tension. From above, something shifted. A sound, faint, dry, real, not machine, not echo, straw. The judge's head turned sharply. Sheriff Rowan was already climbing the steps. He unbarred the final door. The room smelled of salt and cold milk. There, beneath the bell, under a sheet thin as gauze, lay a boy with hair too clean for burial, cheeks pale but unmarked. A ribbon lay beside his neck. One eye twitched. The chest rose, shallow, then again. Clara felt it before she saw it. the unmistakable movement of breath, cold, but living. The judge stood silent for a long moment, then turned to Vale, whose face had not moved, though something beneath his skin had gone terribly still. "He's breathing," the judge said. "You declared him dead," Vale replied. "He was measured quiet. There is a difference." The words sealed it. The order came before the fan had cooled. The elevator was to be opened. The gallery emptied, the rails torn up. Recovery halted, all remaining rooms searched, the ledger impounded. The cot, with the boy upon it, was carried down by hands that trembled not from weight, but from what it meant to lift something that had been signed away. Vale stood in the middle of the main floor as daylight came through the door and struck the circle of cots. He did not move to block it. He did not argue. He simply watched as the dust swirled into the air he could no longer manage. The fan would not start again. The silence had cracked. He stood there a long while, not detained yet, just standing, like a man who had studied every breath except the one that defied him. The boy had taken it, without permission, without the bell. And in that moment Vale heard it. The one silence he could not control. The one that lives after paper fails. The silence of something that breathes again. In the months that followed, Brackenfield looked the same on the outside, same ferry wake on the river, same wheat bending in the same wind. But inside homes and inside the courthouse walls, the old ways of trust were cracked wide open. What began as a quiet inquiry became law. By the spring of 1873, the county had passed what it named the Burial Witness and Certification Act, written in urgent ink that bled through the paper. It was simple in language, but ironclad in requirement. No death could be certified without two witnesses who bore no blood relation. No interment could occur within 24 hours of certification. No doctor could declare a passing without a second physician present, and no declaration could be made behind closed curtains. Private veils were outlawed. All ledgers of death were to be copied in duplicate and posted in the county paper each week. In full, the law read, "For the safety and dignity of breath." The Mercy Circle dissolved without ceremony. The parish hall was closed to private care. No one barred Dorothea Pike from worship, but she no longer led the opening prayer. The bathhouse was shuttered, its copper pans emptied, its veils burned behind the rectory. The town did not speak of Vale directly, not at first. His name was not carved or cursed. It simply stopped being said. Dr. Lucius Banner stayed longer than he meant to. He published a pamphlet at his own expense called On the Signs of Life, written plainly for the use of midwives, caretakers, and elders. It included diagrams and a checklist of mistakes too easily made, with a final page that read, "Breath is not belief. Count twice." Families came quietly to the elevator with permission slips and ledgers in hand. Some asked for names to be returned. Some asked only for ashes. The boy with the ribbon survived. He spoke little, but he walked. He later worked as a glass cutter in a nearby town and kept his windows open year-round, even in winter. Others from the recovery list lived in corners, took jobs in quiet factories, or stitched clothing by hand in basements that never locked. None of them gave interviews. None of them asked for apology, but they all lived facing the light. The stone wall by the river came last. Built by townspeople who had read the full list in the paper, it bore all 29 names. Some had living hands to press their initials into the mortar. Some had no one left to trace the letters. Beneath the final row, in smaller text, the town engraved a single line. Count breath. Count again. And every spring, when the wind shifts back from the north and the river brings a colder draft through the reeds, the stone sweats lightly in the morning light, reminding Brackenfield that stillness is not proof and silence must never be mistaken for peace. Years after the elevator was emptied and the cots dismantled, after the law was passed and the bell was rung again for the right reasons, Clara's personal papers were unsealed by quiet order. A note attached to the file read, "To be opened when memory begins to thin." Inside were her observations, not of events but of a man. She wrote about Dr. Erasmus Vale with a precision that felt colder than anger, yet warmer than contempt. She described a mind that prized quiet over truth, a man who had no use for noise, not because he hated suffering, but because he believed it was inefficient. She wrote, he thought people were like birds, meant to be calmed, caged, and stilled long enough to be understood, and once understood made docile. She detailed his instruments one by one. The glass-lung bell, which drew out breath with no violence. The stillness harness, which taught the ribs to forget their rhythm. The thimble test, so small and clean it almost seemed tender. The veil bath, where death could be softened to resemble sleep. The hushing fan tuned to keep panic from forming. And the clock of breath, which reduced a life to tick marks and empty silence. None of it looked like harm. That was the horror. Every device was made with care, wrapped in gauze and intention. They looked like help. They promised ease. And that was what Vale understood best. Evil doesn't come snarling. It comes soft, measured, polite. It wraps itself in mercy and speaks with a gentle voice. It offers solutions, systems order. It tells you that grief is messy and dignity is quiet. That science must make choices for you. That stillness is the greatest kindness. Clara called it the quiet that power loves. She warned that it would return, not in glass bells or thimbles maybe, but in other names, other tools, other forms of necessary care. And that we should not look for it in shadows but in offices, in programs, in kind voices that make cruel things feel reasonable. The film ends where it began, at the river wall. The names are still there, chiseled into stone that sweats when the wind shifts. The bell now rings again for the dead. But the camera lingers not on the stone, nor the church, nor the river, but on the silence between them. The kind that waits for permission. The kind that doesn't get questioned. And then a question is asked, not with blame but with weight. What do you think? Could this happen again? Any place where paper declares truth and no one listens for breath?